This is The Extra Mile.
Hey everyone, welcome back to The Extra Mile. I'm Caleb, not with George today with G5. I'm with Dr. Nathan Ward. He's a professor here at Florida College, and he is someone who sparked my interest in apologetics as a student here not so long ago. You went from getting your AA here at Florida College all the way to a doctorate. What was that specifically in?
It's a Doctor of Ministry in Theological Exegesis, which sounds really, really fancy, doesn't it?
It does sound fancy, and interesting at least to me.
Yeah, there you go.
Perhaps not all, but his perspective I found personally in my life really valuable to my faith, my relationship with others, and with God. I hope that's the same for you. Definitions matter, so how would you define apologetics, just to start?
Fundamentally, an apologetic is a defense of something. Mm-hmm. Within our discussion, we're typically talking about Christian apologetics or biblical apologetics, mm-hmm. Or some other subset of that, which is going to be defenses for the Christian faith. Mm-hmm. And there are a variety of kinds of that. There are philosophical arguments that deal in the conceptual world. There's historical apologetics, which deals in history itself. There's apologetics that are rooted in the biblical text. There are apologetics that are rooted in answering questions raised by skeptics. And so it's defending the faith is basically what it is when we talk about apologetics.
Yeah. I think of 1 Peter 3:15, in your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that's in you. Yet, do it with gentleness and respect. And defense is where we're getting that word, apologetic.
Yeah, that is, in the Greek, that is the word apologia, that apologetics comes from there. And of course, Peter's talking about something a little bit different than what we do. Mm-hmm. He's talking about being put on trial and having your head chopped off by Nero. So it's a little bit of a different idea, but I think certainly the principle of making a defense, even if you're not in a literal trial situation, the principle extends very well.
Sure,
I don't think
sure.
we're abusing Scripture or anything to talk about apologetics and to use that first to kind of prime the discussion.
Yes. Yeah, and that perhaps makes us a little grateful for our circumstances and what we define as persecution, but that would be a discussion for another time.
Yes.
I'm sure it would be. As Christians, what do you think apologetics and the defense of the faith should be for in our own life?
I may be a little bit different in this than where some people stand, but my perspective on apologetics is that it's a better shield than it is a sword. Mm. And what I mean by that is that it's something that we should use to defend our faith, not something that we should use to create faith in other people. Mm. The way that I put that sometimes is Paul doesn't say that he's not ashamed of, the cosmological argument because it's the power of God to salvation. Or he's not ashamed of the minimal facts argument for the resurrection because it's the power of God to salvation. Or whatever else we might come up with from the field of apologetics. It's the gospel that's the power of God to salvation. That's the sword that we have. That's the offensive weapon. That's what we take and convert people with. And the role of apologetics is, I think, better suited for people who are believers, answering the questions that come to them and bolstering their faith and strengthening their faith along the way. I think it can play a role in converting people, but its role is supportive, not starring. It's really good when they have lingering questions. When I'm really convinced about Jesus, I'm really compelled by Jesus, but I don't know what to do with this issue. Mm. What apologetics can do is come in and kind of smooth over some of those hurdles. But if we start putting the central focus in our teaching on apologetics, as far as a method of converting people, I think we have our priorities out of whack. So my feeling is that apologetics is a better shield than it is a sword.
I like that. The supporting actor, not the star. Shield. Yeah. I like that imagery a lot. Obviously, in our Western scientific mindset, science is definitely at the forefront when you think of apologetics, and it's loaded with so many things behind it. But how do we generically respond to the idea, I've heard this, you've heard it too, that science has officially disproved God?
Well, the answer to it, the question is whether it'll convince anyone or not. Mm-hmm. And that's a separate question. But the answer to that allegation, assertion is the word I'm looking for. The answer to that assertion is that it hasn't and it can't. Because science deals in the natural world. That's one of the things you hear all the time if you get involved in science, is they deal with what they call methodological naturalism, which means the methodology they use is naturalistic. They only can study things in this natural world, and they can only study them by using natural means. Apply natural variables to natural situations, and you come up with natural conclusions. That is what science is by definition. God is by definition supernatural.
Yeah.
Science cannot speak to the existence or the non-existence of God because they're two different things in two different realms. Now, science can maybe raise questions about God's existence,
Sure,
but it can't test those questions because it is outside of the realm of science. And so, the basic answer to the question, or to the assertion that science has disproven God, is no, it hasn't, it can't. It's not equipped to do that.
right.
So I would hope that when someone says that, they're just kind of shorthanding, using that statement as some sort of shorthand for something bigger, which is science has suggested we don't need God anymore to explain
Right.
the universe, or something like that is probably what they mean. But there's a reason to kind of push back on that, even as shorthand. Let's be more precise in our language.
Yeah.
Let's make sure we know what we're saying and how we're saying it, rather than saying things that are flatly untrue as shorthand for something that is maybe an interesting topic to discuss.
Yes. It is a very interesting topic, but it sounds like we quickly blend, the text and the Bible with science very easily, and the Western mindset. And it's not just Christians, it's those who are skeptical, agnostic, and atheists who will do the same, and basically make arguments that Scripture's not making. Is there any potholes that you find that we should be steering clear from when it comes to the scientific debate, like where we should be and where we shouldn't be in these discussions?
Yeah. Let me start on the negative side, because there are two things I think we do, or we're tempted to do, or we can slip into. One is what's called a God of the gaps argument. God of the gaps is where you say science can't explain this, therefore God must be the explanation for it. And the problem with that is you're starting with ignorance, and you just don't know what the answer to it is. And so if you put God in all of the gaps that science can't explain, what happens when science explains it in 20 years?
Right.
And it's, one thing if that happens to one or two things and you say, oh, I was wrong. But what if science explains everything that you've put God in a gap? Well, okay, we don't need God anymore. And that brings us back to science's proving that God doesn't exist. We no longer need God to explain our existence because science has explained it all. Well, that's the problem if you only see God in those gaps. A better way of thinking about it is God is in those gaps because God is everywhere, and God is behind all of it. And even things science has explained doesn't mean that God is not an even greater explanation for those things.
Yeah.
And so seeing God as, the way the Bible would put it, as the creator and the sustainer of the universe, that means he's in everything, not just in the gaps. So we want to avoid that God of the gaps mentality. And the second one, it will probably get me in trouble with some people, and that's scientific foreknowledge. The idea that the Bible has, in it has hidden details of science that the people back then couldn't have known. The circle of the earth in Isaiah, the earth is hung on nothing in Job. Those kinds of passages that talk about the rotundity and the free suspension of the earth, and other things along those lines. There are entire books written about this sort of thing. And without getting into a lot of detail, what I'd say about that is a few things. First of all, every single example of so-called scientific foreknowledge that I'm aware of is in a poetic passage.
All of them?
Just about all of them, if not all of them.
Yeah.
I've not gone through a list in a long time to see for sure, but it's a massive proportion, if not all of them, are in poetry.
Wow. Which
Which is your first clue probably that you shouldn't read it scientifically because it's in poetry.
Yeah.
And so you're in texts that deal with figures of speech all the time. There's one that I've come across. It's also in Job, where it says when, I don't remember the exact phrase, but basically when God laid the foundations of the earth, the stars sang for joy or something like that.
Yeah.
And the argument is that we have discovered in our modern scientific brilliance that light is emitted in waves that has a tonal quality.
Oh, yes, I've heard of this one.
Which means that you can literally say the stars are singing. Which brings me to my second point, aside from the fact that I think that's pretty obviously a figure of speech, in a poetic figure of speech, that the second problem is that we interpret our science inconsistently in the Bible. And what I mean is, when it agrees with current scientific thinking, we say that it's scientific foreknowledge. When it doesn't agree with current scientific thinking, we say it's figurative language. So the morning star is singing, that's science. When it's the fire and hail and vapor and dragons and cedar trees in Psalm 148 that are singing, well, that's just figurative language. When the earth it has a circle, that's scientific foreknowledge. When the earth has four corners, that's figurative language. When the earth is free suspending, the earth is hung on nothing, that's scientific foreknowledge. When it has a foundation and a cornerstone, that's figurative language. So we cherry pick the science out of the Bible.
And all those are still within the same poetic context.
Yeah. And even then, sometimes it'll be, within the exact same set of verses. The morning stars singing, 2 verses later, a little bit more than 2 verses later, but in that same chapter, God's speech to Job, there's also bottles in the heavens where the rain's kept. Mm-hmm. And so, there's all sorts of things like that. But then another problem with it is that this is the exact kind of argument that Muslims will use for the validity of the Quran.
Oh.
And if this is a legitimate argument, it's a legitimate argument. We can't say it's legitimate for our book and not legitimate for theirs.
Right.
Either there's legitimacy to the argument or there's not. And so there's that. And then the last problem I'd say is that it engages in a whole lot of chronological snobbery. C.S. Lewis's term for
I love that.
Thinking everyone back then was an idiot. Pythagoras was theorizing both the rotundity and the free suspension of the earth several hundred years before Christ.
That's amazing.
I don't know that he predates Isaiah, so I think you could still say it's scientific foreknowledge if you really wanted to make that argument.
Right.
But the idea that the 2 questions you have to ask for scientific foreknowledge on any verse is, 1, is this scientific, and 2, is it foreknowledge? Because if it fails one of those 2 tests, then you got a problem. And then the third one is there another verse in the Bible that says the exact opposite that you're ignoring, so you can say this one is science?
Oh.
So
Yeah.
I've got a problem with that kind of use of science. I think there are a lot of very good reasons to trust in the Bible without having to rely on that, is what I'd say.
Well, let's talk about that here in a sec and switch gears from the scientific side to more philosophical side of apologetics today. Our culture is really big into your truth is your truth, my truth is my truth. Everyone has their truth, and at the same time, at least here in the West, in America, we have a big sense of justice right now happening in the United States. So you kind of have these competing figures that there is justice, there is right and wrong, and yet everyone's truth is their own. How does this inherently become an apologetic topic that we should be involved in?
Well, apologetics is fundamentally rooted in the idea that there is truth and you can know the truth, that it's knowable. That's Christianity too, right?
Yes.
You will know the truth and the truth will set you free. And we're in a culture that is, to be a little bit more technical, postmodern is what the culture is,
right,
which is itself a slingshot back or pendulum swing away from modernism. And without getting into all of the history of that, modernism kind of arose out of the Enlightenment, and it had the idea that science is going to solve all of humans' problems, and knowledge is going to solve all of human problems. And where all of that ultimately led to kind of give a shortened version, is the 20th century, where what is prominent in the 20th century is World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf War. And you think about where science and knowledge led us, it was to atomic bombs and all sorts of horrific sorts of things.
Yeah.
And obviously there's more to it than just that. I don't want to totally oversimplify socio-political events, because I think that's a mistake that people make sometimes when, we won't get into all of that. But that is a mistake that can be made. And so understand there's a whole lot more going on than just that. But it did lead to a massive shift in the public's thinking about science. That, obviously science isn't fixing all of our problems. And what happens very often is when you have all of your eggs in one basket and you find out that the basket's leaking, you don't move moderately away from that. You swing as hard as you can to the other side.
And that's where we're going now.
Yeah, and that's where, I mean, since the middle of the 20th century, I think it was in the 60s, that postmodern was used for the first time. The term postmodern was used for the first time.
Gotcha.
And it's just been growing ever since. And with that relativism, the idea that anybody's truth is equal, with that pluralism, the idea that all religions are basically equal and valid. Mm-hmm. But yeah, the notion that anyone can create their own truth is the culture that we live in, and that's completely contrary to a biblical position that says, no, there is one truth, and it is God, and all truth is God's truth and corresponds to that. And so that's, it's going to inherently be an apologetic issue because of just the nature of reality. I mean, frankly, what I think is that that worldview is intellectually bankrupt, and it's non-sustainable. Mm. I mean, reading about this is going to get us into another issue, but we don't have to go all the way down it. The Penn State swimmer.
Oh, yeah.
That is biologically a male, identifies as a female, has not had any sort of surgery to change that.
And he's crushing.
He's killing, but he also is in the women's locker room.
Yep. And
he also still dates women.
Oh, I did not know that second part.
Yeah.
Well, that's a big one. Wow.
Yeah, that's pretty significant.
That's very significant.
And so you think, if this is a, late middle school or high school boy, what would you say about this person who's sneaking into the girls' locker room?
Yeah.
Who's clearly interested in girls, who's clearly not done anything physically to change his gender that he says is not his gender or sex or whatever term you want to use for that, because that's its own debated issue. Mm-hmm. I mean, clearly this is non-sustainable. And I think the vast majority of the public knows it. They're just too afraid to say anything lest they be, censored or canceled or whatever else. I think people in their heart of hearts know that this is really stupid.
Outside of the church, you think Western culture is going to come to its senses on that one? Or?
I think it has to. Yeah. Either that or the whole culture is going to collapse.
Yeah.
I mean, you can't have a sustainable culture where all truth is equal when it's clearly not. And that's the thing about it is, in philosophy and religion and abstract ideas, we want this to be the case. So we can do whatever we want. In hard science and math and real life, it doesn't work.
No.
I mean, you can't decide one day that you're going to fly and go jump off top of a building. And that's my truth. Well, your truth is going to end up falling pretty flat. Quite literally, I suppose.
Yes, quite literally.
In that. I mean, you can't decide, 2 + 2 isn't 4, it's 5 or 7 or giraffe, It's just whatever you want it to be. That's not how it works. And once you're out of the abstract and into the concrete, the bankruptcy of relativism becomes very, very clear.
Yeah. I've always found it so sad amongst my age group and generation, particularly college students who are agnostic or atheist, somewhat in that category, and they're hyped up like racism's a big topic in our country again, and they're like, hey, I feel fired up about these things, and I say, hey, I'm concerned about some of those too. Why do you think racism's wrong? When they don't have absolute truth or morality, anything in the background. And they're always dumbfounded. It's so sad to see them try and grapple as to why this is wrong.
And even if you pushed back and you said, well, that's just your truth, that's not my truth.
Yeah.
I mean, they're depending on the existence of an objective truth in order to push this issue. And I think they're right. I think there is an objective truth. And I think racism is objectively wrong.
Right.
But they're trying to determine that in a culture that has rejected objective truth, and in a culture that has rejected God, who is the source of objective truth and the source of all morality, which I think is the point that you're making there. Mm-hmm. You take God away, you take truth away, and it gets to be really hard. Oh, it's just what seems right to me. Well, I thought we have already decided that what seems right to any individual is completely malleable, and you can make it whatever you want it to be.
Yeah. All these subjects are something we could spend like forever discussing and talking about and researching. We'll keep trucking along here, though. So real quick, just in a couple minutes, you hear a lot from people, including ourselves, Christians, asking, hey, if God, why pain, why suffering? The age-old question that you can answer perfectly in just a couple minutes. Right?
That's right.
Yeah.
This is a topic that I took a semester-long graduate class about, which might make you think I could answer it really well, but It just means that there's so much to say that there's no possible way to say it all.
Yeah.
I mean, this question goes back, to Job, at least.
At least.
Which is a really long time ago. And it's prevalent throughout the Bible in a variety of contexts. The great thinkers, whether Christian or not, have wrestled with this topic. And so this is just a massive, massive issue. It is probably the single biggest objection that gets raised against Christianity, historically speaking, over and over and over through the generations. And I don't think that the logical problem of evil, as it's called, God is all-knowing, God is all-powerful, God is all good, therefore he should know every evil that exists, he should be able to stop every evil that exists, and he should want to stop every evil that exists, but evil exists, therefore there's no God. That's the logical problem of evil. I don't think that really holds up, because any of those sort of logical formulations, if they're constructed in a logically valid way, the conclusion is undeniable. And so you have to say, are all the premises true? And that's where I think there are mitigating factors. I could say, for example, I have a car and I didn't have a car to take to work today. And you say, well, those are contradictory. They both can't be true at the same time, right? Well, they could be true if my wife has my car. They could be true if my car is in the shop. It could be true if my car is a little model car rather than a full-size car. I mean, I could maybe get a second one and strap them to my feet and roller skate to work. But, there are things that seem contradictory that aren't necessarily contradictory. And those sorts of mitigating factors are what you have to ask about the premises. Yes, God is all-knowing and he knows about all suffering. Yes, God is all-powerful and he could therefore stop all suffering. Yes, God is all good and he would want to stop all suffering. But what if suffering has a purpose?
Yeah.
And God is temporarily allowing suffering and he's going to bring it to a conclusion at some point. An illustration that I came across somewhere along the way was the contradictory statements of, I have a cat, the cat is going to eat all the mice in my house, there are still mice in my house, therefore I don't have a cat. Well, no, I have a cat, he's right over there doing nothing, right? So maybe the cat's lazy. Maybe the cat is in the process, maybe you have a massive mouse infestation and the cat is in the process of eating all of the mice and it has not yet completed that process. There's a lot of reasons why something that seems to be self-contradictory isn't. And that, as stupid as it is, maybe is a decent analogy for thinking maybe there is a process and God will one day end suffering. And I think most of us can recognize in some suffering that we faced that at least some good has come out of it. I mean, most people who've endured suffering say it was terrible, but in retrospect, this good thing happened because of it, or these good things happened because of it, or I'm a completely different person and it's marvelous because of it, or whatever else it might be.
Yeah.
And to come back to God's omniscience, if I, in my meager capabilities, can find some good reason in some of the suffering, is it possible that God can see a lot of good reasons in all of the suffering? And so there's that. But ultimately what I'd say is the problem of evil, the problem of suffering, is less of an intellectual and logical problem and more of an emotional one.
Yeah.
We can sit here and talk about all the philosophical reasons why it's not really a problem, but when it hits you square between the eyes...
Yeah, you don't care about that really.
Yeah. And so it's the emotional problem, it's the personal problem, and that's I think it's helpful to bolster up your understanding of the issue so that when that time comes, you're kind of prepared for it.
I recently did a sermon in 1 John 4, the love book, the love chapter, and it was really striking me there how the apostles and all of godly men and women in the Bible speak of God in such a way, and yet, particularly I think the apostles suffered horrendously, and yet they were still able to make such a statement that God is love, that our suffering's not the measuring stick for the love of God.
Yeah, and I mean, I think also something that you see very clearly in the Bible is in the book of Psalms. These lament psalms, which is the largest category of all the psalms. There are more laments than there are anything else. And these are people pouring out their heart and soul and mind to God in the midst of their suffering, saying things to God that makes us uncomfortable to read, something that we feel like we could never say that to God, which I would say is probably part of our problem, that we're not honest with God about our feelings. We're not honest with God about how we hurt because we think it's, I don't know, sacrilegious or something to talk that way to God. But the inspired prayers of the Bible are very open with God. And it's not like God doesn't know what you're thinking anyway, so you can't, just because you don't pray about it doesn't mean that he doesn't know. So, and I tell you, if one of my kids came to me and said something to me that was not an accurate representation of reality, I would call that a lie, is what I would call it. So, and there's a sense in which we're trying, it's a misguided piety, where we're trying to say the right things, but in essence what we're doing is lying to God about how we feel. And the more we bury that, the more we cover it up, the more we pretend like it's not there, and the bigger that pile gets, the more it explodes on us when the breaking point comes.
Yeah, that's very valuable. All right, one last shift of gear here,
Sure.
and such a crazy deep and wide subject. Is the Bible the Word of God? And so that's, gets into textual criticism. This is a whole other ordeal, obviously. Probably touches along if there is a God, why even the God of the Bible? I mean, so many subjects arise. But what would you briefly say about when it comes to the Bible being the Word of God?
Well, one thing that I would say is maybe a broader point, which is that just because we are looking for answers doesn't mean we're going to find all of them. Just because we want to make defenses doesn't mean that we can defend from everything, or from evidence, every single point of, Christian belief that we have. You can make a very compelling case that there's a God, philosophically and scientifically and logically and in other ways as well, but you can't scientifically prove God's existence any more than you can scientifically disprove it.
Right.
There is faith that is involved. Now, it's not a blind faith, it's an informed faith. The Bible never commends blind faith. The modern notion that faith and reason are opposite poles is a non-biblical concept, and we don't need to chase all that out all the way, but just to kind of say that is to say that what can we prove about the Bible? What can we not prove about the Bible? We can make very good arguments that it's historically reliable. There's been a ton of work that's been done on that in a variety of different directions. We can make good arguments that the books that are in the Bible are the books that should be in the Bible. We can make very good arguments that it was passed down to us accurately and reliably, and that gets into textual criticism and manuscripts and those sorts of things. I don't think we can prove that it's God's Word. That's a step of faith. You believe it because you believe in Jesus, who says, the scriptures of his day were God's Word. And he says to his apostles, I'm going to, I presume, supernaturally fill you with information so you can continue my message and be my ambassadors. But it is based on that, and based on Paul's statement in 2 Timothy 3 as well, that these documents are the inspired Word of God. Paul says something similar in 2 Corinthians, I believe it is, about spirit-filled words. But I don't know how to empirically prove that.
Sure.
So I think there's a balance on that question. And I wanted to say that before, maybe turning to some of those specific nuts and bolts that we can prove.
Yeah. So for someone who is relatively new to just the subject of the reliability of Scripture, is there a book or a thought that you would recommend to such a person?
Yeah. I've got a friend who is, this is a little bit of a sidetrack, but I've got a friend, he's a professor of philosophy at Western Michigan University. And he always says, be careful when you ask me for book recommendations. He says, I'm the guy that's chasing the grad. I've already overloaded the grad student with a stack of books, and I'm chasing him down the hall going, wait, I have 3 more. So I'm not to that point, but I kind of feel that way sometimes. So for someone who's just beginning, I think one of the absolute best starting places is a little book. It's about 110 pages as well. Written by Peter Williams, who's a British scholar, called Can We Trust the Gospels? It's just a fantastic starting point. And the Gospels are the best place to start. I teach a class here on biblical evidences related to the Bible, and I spend about half the semester focused on the reliability of the New Testament, and specifically the Gospels. I'll bring Acts into it because it's written by a Gospel author, so it adds credibility to him. But basically my perspective is, if I can show you that the Gospels are reliable, then you have to take Jesus seriously. And if you take Jesus seriously from the picture of the Gospels, you can come to faith in him. And then what he says matters most.
Yeah.
And so when he spends his entire ministry only speaking highly of the Old Testament, and never once raising questions about its authenticity or its authority or whether we have the right books, and they had the same books in Jesus' day that we have in our Old Testaments now. I can come back to that in a second if you want to. Then I have no question about the Old Testament. Now, there may be some individual questions that I'll want to chase out, but if Jesus isn't worried about the Old Testament, I don't see why I should be.
Yeah.
And if Jesus says to his apostles, you're going to continue my work, then that gives me confidence in the rest of the documents as well. So from a very simplistic sort of starting point, I'd say you start with the Gospels and then kind of let some of those natural logical conclusions flow from that. And William's book is, I think, the best starting point. I'd give you probably a dozen different books
I'm sure.
on the reliability of the Gospels.
That's a good starting point.
From different perspectives. That's a really good place to start. And he also, I'm trying to remember if he does a bibliography or for more recommendations, but what he does do is he footnotes a lot of other sources as he goes through, and so you can build a reading list from his footnotes if he doesn't give an explicit one later on.
And what's this book one more time?
Can We Trust the Gospels by Peter J. Williams, I think it's
Cool.
J.
Now, in that specific question, what do you say to people, whether they're a skeptic, LDS are running this a lot, is the New Testament corrupted, or they make the claim it's been corrupted? What's a quick thought to that?
It hasn't. A little bit more than that. That's too quick.
Is that too quick?
Basically what that amounts to is two things that are both true, and I think Christians should know. One is that we have no originals of any biblical document. Mm-hmm. Frankly, I think that's probably good, because my suspicion is that it would turn into an idol.
An idol. Yeah.
If we had Paul's original letter to the Romans, you hear stories about some lady that makes a grilled cheese sandwich and is convinced that Mary's face is in the toast marks and sells it for thousands of dollars on eBay. And if you could do that with a Jesus sandwich, what do you think would happen with the actual biblical document? So I don't know that that's why God let them be destroyed, but I think it's a nice side effect of it. We're avoiding idolatry with the Bible. In a very literal sense.
Yeah.
So we have no originals is the first point. The second one is among the copies that we have, there are hosts of differences. Literally there are thousands of differences among all the copies that we have.
Sure.
So let me address that very quickly. First of all, there is no ancient document that we have originals of. Nothing from antiquity. So if you're going to say we can't trust it because we don't have the originals, you're throwing out everything. Everything. And there goes all of our historical knowledge of the ancient world. And we don't, distrust Josephus or Tacitus or Suetonius or Herodotus or whoever else because we don't have the originals. We work with what we have. Mm-hmm. The second thing is that the reason there are thousands of differences is because there are thousands of manuscripts. Mm-hmm. And you can't get to thousands of differences with Tacitus because last I knew there were only 2 manuscripts of Tacitus that have been found. And it's not even overlapping section. There's one section in one manuscript, another section in another manuscript, and a big chunk of it is still missing. So there are no differences because you don't have anything to compare to.
Right.
And even in Josephus that we have more copies of, we're talking about dozens, maybe scores. I don't think they're up to hundreds of Josephus manuscripts. But when you have, 80 manuscripts of something, you're not going to find thousands of differences. So that's the first thing, is this problem of wealth. There are more manuscripts and older manuscripts and better manuscripts of the New Testament than anything else from antiquity, and it's not even close. We're talking about thousands to hundreds in most cases at best. The Iliad, there are a few thousand, but the oldest of those is several hundred years removed from the original.
Wow.
Now, as to the differences themselves, the short answer is that 90-some% of them don't make any difference. Most of them are spelling errors. Or spelling differences where a word evolves and it changes spelling. It's still legitimate spelling, but it's a 3rd century spelling instead of a 1st century spelling.
Yeah.
So the vast majority are spelling errors. I tell you, as a teacher, I know all about spelling errors and how much it impacts your reading of something, because I have papers that are turned in with things butchered. I had a student turn in a paper several years ago. It was in my Ephesians class, and this poor student spelled the word Ephesians about 5 different ways in the same paper.
That's rough.
one of the times it was spelled so badly that I think autocorrect took over or something, and it changed it to echidnas. The little animal. But I tell you, what happened is every time I read one of those...
Paul's favorite.
Yeah. Every time I read one of those butcherings of the word Ephesians, I knew exactly what it meant.
Right.
So most of them are spelling errors. A lot of them are transposition, where it'll say, for example, Jesus Christ instead of Christ Jesus. And it doesn't change the meaning of the sentence. Or in Greek, you can reorder a sentence to a certain limit, and it still is the same sentence. Because it's case-based instead of order-based language.
Yeah.
And so you can move words around. It means the exact same thing. And
Sure.
so 90-some% of the variants don't change the meaning of the sentence.
And this helps us take Jesus and who he is and what he says seriously, and that's the foundation point.
And and everything that we have has not been changed.
So what about the skeptic, though, who comes in and says, that's nice. Is there any evidence for historical Jesus outside of the Bible?
Yeah, there's more of that than there is for just about anything in the ancient world.
Wow.
It's kind of remarkable that that there are people who will still try to argue that Jesus never existed. When Tacitus, the Roman historian, mentions Jesus, and Josephus, the Jewish historian, mentions Jesus, and there are others, Suetonius, Pliny, my mind's going blank, Julius Africanus, and then a few others that mention either him or Christians that are in Christianity as being based on somebody who was around.
Right.
And you don't get a ton of information about it, but you can get, a 7 or 8 point, from all of the different sources, 7 or 8 bullet points, that is a pretty fair synopsis of the gospel story.
Really?
That from beginning to end, you have, him being born at a certain time period, you have him being a minister, you have him being someone who was a teacher and did amazing things of some kind, and who was crucified under Pilate, and his followers believed that he rose from the dead and they worship him as God. And you're talking about an 8 bullet point summary of Jesus'
That's pretty
life.
good.
You could do a lot worse than that.
That's not bad.
And this is from multiple sources. And the thing that's really crazy is you stop and you think about it. How many ancient historians do you suspect were interested in itinerant rabbis?
Yeah.
This is a guy that is not going to make anybody's radar.
Sure.
So the fact that so many ancient historians write about him at all is pretty remarkable. Bart Ehrman is a very skeptical biblical scholar.
Yeah.
He's one of those guys, one of the experts they trot out on CNN and stuff every Easter and Christmas to come up with some skeptical position. And he is very, very skeptical. In his popular level writing, he's even more skeptical than he is in his academic level writing, and he'll say things that are pretty non-defensible. But I bring him up to say that Bart Ehrman has said, this is not an exact quote, but this is a paraphrase, and it's pretty close. He said, anyone that thinks Jesus did not exist does not know what he's talking about, historically speaking. So when you have someone that is that skeptical and that known for being skeptical and for questioning the validity of the Bible, saying, if you don't think Jesus existed, you're an idiot, I think that's a pretty good bit of evidence on our side.
And so obviously the biggest claim in human history and the biggest claim about Jesus would be, hey, he was killed. After 3 days, he rose from the dead. Quick bullet points when it comes to, we could spend a whole not just a whole podcast, way too long on the subject. What are some quick bullet points about the historicity of the resurrection of Jesus? Yeah,
so I would say that kind of depends on which direction you want to go, and people go both ways on this, and I can see validity for both sides. If you spend the time building a very robust case for the historicity of the Gospels themselves and how reliable they are as historical documents, then you've got a ton of evidence. Because at that point, you've got to start taking what they say seriously. Now, what is very in vogue these days is what's called the minimal facts argument for the resurrection.
Okay.
This was, I think, pioneered by Gary Habermas, who is a professor of philosophy at Liberty University. And Michael Licona has kind of picked up that mantle, and he's running with it some more at this point. But basically what it does is says, let's start with just those facts that would be widely agreed upon by both believing and unbelieving biblical New Testament historical scholars. And if you start with just those things that can be agreed upon, you still have to come up with something that explains them. I mean, something happened that has created this coalescence of facts. And so what it amounts to are, and there are various lists by various people, and you can find people that will disagree with anything.
Sure.
And so whether these 5 that I'm going to list now are the definitive minimal facts right now, it changes. But Jesus died by crucifixion. The tomb was empty. The disciples believed that they saw Jesus after he had been killed and buried. Now, whether he was resurrected or not is debatable, but at least everyone agrees the disciples believed they saw him. Paul was converted. James was converted. So what accounts for just those 5 things? And you go through all of the different theories that the best minds of science and philosophy have come up with over 2,000 years, and they don't touch it. I mean, the whole swoon theory, that Jesus just passed out on the cross. I mean, that's the most ridiculous theory in the world, because there's no way he didn't die. But, even if you grant that, what does that explain? The empty tomb. Because how's he going to then go, do all the rest of this stuff and convert all these people? Well, it's just the empty tomb. And in fact, it turns out that if you look at most of them, the stolen body theory, the wrong tomb theory, the various versions of those sorts of things, it's the empty tomb. The other approach is explaining the appearances, which is either a hallucination theory or some sort of visionary theory. But then the tomb's not empty anymore, and you'd expect the Jews would have just drug out Jesus' body and stopped Christianity on day one.
That's always amazing that they're not just like, here's your dead Messiah.
And I tell you, the 2 that are most compelling to me as I think about just those minimal facts is the conversions of James and Paul.
Yeah.
Because you've got Paul, who is 100% convinced that Jesus is not the Messiah and Christianity must be stopped.
Yeah.
And from that, he goes to 100% convinced that Jesus is the Messiah and Christianity must be spread. Something has to account for that change.
Yeah.
And James is the one that I think we probably don't think enough about, because, this is a brother of Jesus. This is someone who was raised with him, who knew him his whole life.
Must have been rough.
Yeah, right. But here's the thing about it is, anyone who has a sibling loves their sibling, unless they're just awful and cruel, sociopath or whatever. But you love your sibling, and even if they're bad, there's still something. They're my brother, and you've got love, you've got respect. You would defend them, you would go to bat for them. And the question you have to ask yourself, put yourself in James' shoes. What would it take to convince you that your brother is God?
A lot.
And grapple with that.
Yeah, your brother is God.
Because something convinced James that his brother was God.
Yeah, that's so true. He is quite overlooked when it comes. Paul's great for obvious reasons, but James, your brother is God.
Yep.
Wow.
Something happened.
Yeah.
And again, 2,000 years worth of skeptics trying have come up with theories that explain independently of each other 2 of the pieces of evidence, the empty tomb or the appearances, but even those are in isolation from one another. You have to start combining theories to explain 2 of the 5.
That's powerful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, again, that's just what people agree with. You go beyond that to a bigger biblical picture where you have even more eyewitnesses and appearances, and it gets harder and harder and harder to explain it all.
Wow. Well, obviously, skeptics, atheists, agnostics are not the only ones who have questions.
Yeah.
They're not the only ones who have doubts. I, Caleb, I'm young but a minister, I have my questions. Right. And every single Christian, I think, just about will have, in different ways and at different times, different questions and doubts. As followers of Jesus, what should we do when we have serious doubts?
Pursue them.
Pursue.
Don't sweep them under. That gets us back to what we were saying about the problem of evil. You start sweeping your doubts under the rug, and it will be a colossal disaster later on, because they won't stay hidden forever. Maybe you can ignore them if it was true that biblical faith is blind faith, but it's not.
Yeah.
And we talk about faith and doubt as if they're opposites, but because faith is not knowledge, there are always questions that are going to be unanswered.
Yeah.
And that means doubt is, at least in some sense, the other side of the same coin as faith. I did 45-minute long or so podcast with Kenny Embry on the issue of doubt specifically. So maybe
go check that out.
Maybe the short answer is to look at that. His podcast is called, I think it's called Balancing the Christian Life.
Yeah, I think so.
And I did an entire podcast talking about doubt, and we talked about that from a variety of perspectives, the things that cause doubt, a pathway to dealing with the sort of doubt. But my short answer for you is don't ignore your doubts, pursue them, ask the questions. The truth has nothing to fear, and if what we believe is true, then it's okay to ask questions.
I love that. Pursue them. I really enjoy that. Well, the last segment we have is Faith in Action here on the Extra Mile podcast. James, too, you might say that's kind of redundant. Yeah. It should go hand in hand. How can we give a defense for the hope that is in us to, skeptics? Sometimes people are even hostile, but how can we do that with gentleness and respect, as 1 Peter 3:15 guides us to do?
Well, I think it begins with the beginning of that verse, which is, in your heart sanctify Jesus Christ as Lord. The more that you make Jesus the Lord of your life and the Lord of your heart, then the rest of it will fall into place a little bit more naturally. If you make your apologetics about you and about scoring points and about winning arguments, you're not going to get very far. Yeah. If you make it about defending the Lord because He's the Lord, then that's going to be part of what sets the stage for having the right attitude in those kinds of conversations. There's a really good book by Greg Koukl, is his name, Koukl is how that's spelled, called Tactics, where he talks about a variety of very practical ways of sharing your faith. I don't know that it's the end-all to every sort of thing. I mean, different situations will always require different methodology. Different people will respond differently to different things. But he goes through a variety of methods of how to have those conversations easily and naturally. I think it's a very helpful resource and starting point for kind of going out and doing some of those things. But I'd say it does begin with the beginning of that verse, sanctify Jesus Christ as Lord in your heart.
That's beautiful. Well, that was Nathan Ward, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Ward, for taking your time discussing these things. Thank you guys for listening. I hope this was encouraging and edifying for you. Pursue your doubts. Pursue the lost. The truth has nothing to hide. It has nothing to fear. Thank you again for coming on. We'll see you guys.